Hi, welcome to the first video in our new series, City Government 101, where we're going to be covering various topics in city government that will help you guys get engaged with your local city government. I'm Annahlyse Meyer, the Chief Communications Officer for the city, and I'm joined here today with Anthony Francisco, our Director of Finance. We're going to talk about budget basics, and how you can get involved.
Very good.
So, Anthony, I know these are these big books here, or your two budget books here. Can you talk to us a little bit about how we get from various budget things to having these two condensed forms here?
Okay, so the budget documents that you see there are the culmination of the budget process that goes on throughout the year. But it is the communication tool for the city, as I see it, because everything that you would want to know about the city, not just the finances, but the operations of the city, is talked about in the budget document in some form.
Yeah, and I think I got a little bit ahead of myself on this. So, is this your main role with the city, is to create the budget book, or what is your role as a city, and what is your role in directing the finances?
Okay, so yes, the monitoring, production, and just kind of producing the budget is a major responsibility that we have, but obviously we also have responsibility for the accounting and the financial reporting, the treasury, the investments, the debt administration. All of those things are in the financial world.
Got it. Okay. So this book represents everything that the city will spend money on this year out of our general fund. So there's a general fund. What are the other funds? You hear a lot about this is the city's general fund, and we have to make sure it's at zero balance. So what are some other funds that we have to worry about too?
Okay, so under the State Municipal Budget Act, which is the statute that we have to work under, every fund of the city has to have a positive fund balance.
Okay. Positive being is zero counted
Zero
positive?
or more.
Okay.
Yeah. So the city has 28 funds altogether. The general fund is the largest fund, but it's only one. So we also have a lot of special revenue funds where there's some dedicated revenue source that we're accounting for in a separate fund. We have capital funds, we have enterprise funds for our utilities. So all of those things taken together, there are about 28 funds altogether, and they all have to have a positive fund balance.
Okay, that's a lot. So, got a couple of follow-up questions on that. First, what does it mean to have what does a positive balance look like to have zero? Why would your budget be at zero? Does that mean your expenses match your income? What
Not
does that
necessarily.
mean?
Fund balance, if you
Okay.
will, is the difference between liabilities and assets. But
Okay.
what that basically means is that you have some money at least in the savings account.
Okay.
I like to make an analogy between a savings account and a checking account in that the funds of the city are spent out of the checking account, if you will, but the revenue, the money, is in the savings account. And the act of taking money out of the savings account and putting it into the checking account for expenditure is the act of appropriating the money.
Okay.
And only the council, the elected officials, the governing body, can appropriate money from the savings account, if you will, to the checking account, from fund balance to expenditure accounts.
Okay. So, relating that to terms that everybody else can understand that doesn't have a degree in finance. So if I have a checking account and a savings account and I want to go make a big purchase like a car, I have everything I have enough money in my savings account to spend it, but now I just need to transition that over to my checkings account and
Correct.
then
And
spend
that
all that money,
transfer
and the
that you
checking
just
account
did.
goes to zero. So whatever I take out of the savings account just has to be accounted for back to zero?
Yes.
Okay.
And you have to have at least $1 in your
Okay.
savings account, or else you have violated state law.
Oh, so I couldn't have just exactly enough in my savings account to buy the car. I would have to have exactly enough plus $1.
A positive
Okay,
fund balance.
okay, so we always have something in the savings account.
For each
Oh, yeah.
fund, yes.
Got it, and assigning that money is just bringing it to zero, assigning that money out to be
Yes.
spent?
Now,
Okay.
the thing is that in a given year, you can spend more than you take in that year, as long as you had money in the savings account, in fund balance, to cover what you spent that you didn't have money coming in that year.
Okay.
So when I say positive fund balance, what I mean is that, let's say that you had in your checking account $100, and that you're projecting that in this year you're going to spend $200, and you're projecting that you're going to bring in $150. Well, when you do your budget, can project that you're going to spend $50 of your savings, appropriate that into the checking account, into the expenditure account, and you still have a legally balanced budget because you still have a positive fund balance.
Okay. So, and you also mentioned, that all makes sense. Thank you for that explanation. You also mentioned that there's a couple different funds here. So there's the general fund, there's the capital fund, and then there's the enterprise fund. What's the difference in the general fund and the capital fund?
The basic difference between the general fund and the general fund is the catch-all fund. Under the state law, the definition of a general fund is, my high school basic composition teacher would have said I would have gotten an F, because it's basically defined as the fund that you don't have anything accounted for someplace else. So a small town might only have a general fund. But in the city of Norman, we have a general fund, we have an art and public places fund, we have a parkland development fund, we have a capital fund, we have a sewer enterprise fund. So all of those things, those 28 funds, there are definite purposes for each of those funds.
And do all of those get their money, their revenue from the same place?
No,
Okay.
and that's why you have separated funds. For example, we have a water reclamation fund, which is the sewer fund. Well, obviously, you want to have that separated out, because the revenues that are going into that fund are only coming from the sewer customers of the city.
Okay.
And that's really important in a city like Norman, where we have thousands of residents and citizens of Norman who don't get their sewer service from the city. They have a privately owned septic tank or a septic system. So why should they pay a sewer bill to the city when they don't get services from the city?
That makes
Why
total
should their
sense.
taxes go to pay for sewer services when they don't receive the services? That's why you separate that out.
So one of the benefits of having these kind of separate funds is that you kind of pay for the things that you use.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
The general fund is using the taxes that are providing services to everybody and that cannot be denied to anybody.
Yeah.
We have a separate water fund, and if you don't pay your water bill, you get your water turned off. But we can't say to any citizen, you can't drive on Main Street. It's open to everybody. That is a
You
public
didn't pay your
service.
taxes this year, so stay
Right.
off our streets.
Exactly.
Got
Can't
it.
do that.
Okay.
It's open to everybody, and that's why that is a tax-supported service.
Okay, that all makes sense. So with the capital funds, that's the general fund. With the capital fund, what kinds of projects are in that?
The capital fund, by definition, are for high-dollar, brick and mortar, tangible facilities that have a useful life of more than 5 years. So those are things like buildings, streets, bridges, drainage facilities, things that you can touch and feel, and that are not going to be used up this year. And those are usually accounted for in the capital fund, usually paid for out of the dedicated capital sales tax.
Because it would be multi-year projects that you're paying for them over, so you need to set that aside for a few
Yes.
years in advance?
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense. So does each city, are there certain city departments that come all out of one fund or out of another? For example, like Public Works, is that paid for entirely out of, when you're talking like
Public
street
Works is
funds and
almost,
stuff?
yeah, Public Works is almost
Okay.
entirely in the general fund. Again,
Oh,
services.
general fund, I would've thought capital.
No.
Some people would've thought capital because it's all that, like, projects. but-
Engineers who work in the
Uh-huh.
Public Works Department manage a lot of the capital projects that are accounted for in the capital fund. But the employee who is managing those projects and overseeing the contractors who are doing the actual street paving and that sort of thing are paid for in the general fund. But the project, the capital project of widening the street is accounted for in the capital fund.
Okay. That makes sense. So when we're looking at things, so all of these things, do they have line item budgets for where that money comes from? Does this book contain that information?
Yes, every individual line item is summarized in the budget document at
Okay.
the category level. So, for example, Annahlyse's salary is accounted for in the city manager's budget in the general fund, okay? And yes, if you look at the city manager's organization chart, you will see the communications cost center of the city manager's budget, and you would see the highly paid communications officer of the city.
Don't
delineated right
exaggerate.
there.
Yes, so that makes sense. So is that something that's accessible to the public? Like the general public wants to come, how do they access that?
All of the budget documents are available on the city's website, normanok.gov. If you want to get a paper copy of the document, we'll be glad to provide it to anyone who asks. I believe that the finances of the city are the heart of the Open Records Act. And everything that we do is public information. So if any citizen asks for anything related to the city's finances, whether they live in Norman or not, we will provide it to them. Now, if it takes us a long time to put the information together, we'll let them know that it's going to take us a week to get that together. But everything that we do is public information, and it's available, and we pride ourselves and take that responsibility very seriously of providing that information to the public.
You guys have always done a fantastic job as far as our offices have interacted.
Thank you.
I think, so this can seem very daunting for the general, like, average citizen to go through. This thing is very daunting. I mean, even a lot of people working in city government find
Yeah.
it daunting. I know how often we all come to.
Very few people, other than
questions.
myself
Yeah.
or Kim Kaufman, the budget manager,
Yeah.
has actually read this cover to cover. But if you understand the organization of the document and you understand how to find the individual thing that you're looking for, it's probably going to be covered in a page or two or
Okay.
5. And the layout of the document is sort of from the most general to the most detailed. So you can only look at one section, the financial summary section, which is about 30 pages, and have a summary of everything that follows.
Yeah.
So all the information that you really need, you can find on any one or two of those pages.
So if somebody came and wanted to examine any particular department's funding or any program even, you know, say they want to talk about mowing services or topic right now, police services, they could come and how would they get access to that information or find out where to find it?
Of course, the easiest thing to do is to look at the table of contents. There's a table of contents, and you will see, for example, that the police department, which is in the general fund, has an organization chart that starts on page 233. And the police department goes through page 247. So again, that which is the largest of the city departments is covered in those 14 pages and is summarized in the general fund summary.
Got it. So, I mean, having this big piece of information, this big document out there, I know that it can seem like, you know, this is just getting buried, but what's the importance of having this big and detailed of a document?
Well, again, because we want to provide information on everything that the city does. Obviously, any individual citizen may not care about everything that's in here, but everything that the city does is in here. So whatever it is that you're interested in, you can find here. It's there someplace. And that's what we want to do, and we want to provide that information to everyone, with the understanding that everybody doesn't care about mowing, okay?
Yeah.
Everybody doesn't care about stormwater drainage, but your interest may be mowing. And so where do you find that? The mowing crews are in the Public Works Department, okay? You're worried about your trash service. There's a sanitation division summary. There's a sanitation division page that has goals and objectives and performance standards for everything that division does. It's in here somewhere. And our job is to help you find your way around if you have questions.
Got it. So if somebody is getting lost or not understanding the budget, they can call you, your
Absolutely.
office, and ask?
Yes.
Great. And I know, so in here where it talks about different funds, I know that there's different kinds of funds like sales tax or bond issues or things that our residents have voted on. Are we able to move that money around, or what does that look like?
There is an ordinance for everything that revenues are coming in for. And where the voters have approved those ordinances, obviously, we cannot do anything other than what the voters approved, unless the voters vote again and say we want to do something differently.
Great. It looks like we're maybe getting some questions from the public here. We'll take a break to answer. Bryce, could you read this for us?
Yes, we have a question from Norman Citizens for Racial Justice. They asked, is it common for departments to get money from multiple funds, like the PD getting money from the general fund and the public safety sales tax fund, or is that unusual in the budget?
That's a fantastic question. So can you talk about the different funding for various organizations and especially departments and the police, how funding for those work?
Yeah, okay, so it is not regular, but it is not uncommon. You cited one of the exceptions where the police department gets money from the general fund and from the public safety sales tax fund. And by the way, they also get money from the Caesars and Restitution Fund and from the CLEAT fund. And CLEAT is an acronym that I won't try to remember what it stands for. But it gets money from several funds. The Parks Department gets money from the general fund, gets money from the Recreation Fund, gets money from the Parkland Development Fund. So yes, that does happen. All of those funds are discussed in the budget document, and the information is there, so.
And do each of those funds have different rules attached to them?
Yes,
Okay.
again, there's an ordinance that says that the Parkland Development money can only be used to develop parkland. The voters approved a public safety sales tax, and in that ordinance, they delineated what that money could be legally used for, and it cannot be used for anything else. So in that example, the voter said, we want to use these funds to put additional police officers and firefighters on the street. We want to replace some fire equipment. We want to build a new emergency operations center. Those sorts of things are delineated in that ordinance that the voters approved. So no, we cannot use those funds for anything else.
If that fund, this happens often, if sales tax, it's a sales tax, and if it's not generating the sales tax, the amount of money that we had hoped that it would in the ordinance or projected that it would, in that vote or in the ordinance, do we have to then subsidize it? Or what does that look like legally? What's our legal stance on that?
Legally, we still have to do what we told the voters we were going to do at some point. So for example, where we, in the public safety sales tax ordinance that passed, I believe in 2015, we said that we were going to do this school resource officer program. And we were going to add these dispatcher positions and these emergency mechanic positions. And there was a timeline by which we were intending to do it. But we have fallen behind those timelines. We still have the legal mandate to do them, but we've had to delay what we have been mandated to do because the revenues haven't come in at the rate that we had projected, and the cost have increased faster than what we had projected.
Is what happens if we don't deliver on those things?
We've never considered that. We've only considered, I think.
It's shocking to you, I know,
Yeah,
to not
that- no,
deliver on a promise,
yeah,
but let's hear that.
No, okay, I consider it my responsibility to make sure that, that we deliver on the promises that we've made to the voters. Yes, we might delay them, but at some point we will do them.
Yeah.
And that's a sacred, see, sometimes ordinances pass to do things that I don't agree with.
Yeah.
But once those ordinances have passed and the voters certainly have approved them, I'm the CFO guy. My job is to find a way to finance them and get them done.
Carry out the will of the
To
people.
carry out the will of the people. That's my job.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, we're working on right now topically, we're working on passing a budget. Council has to approve a budget by a certain timeline. Can you talk to me about the rules for that and why they have to approve that budget by a certain timeline?
Okay, so those regulations are discussed in the budget document right up front in the city manager's letter. But importantly, by state law, we have to pass a balanced budget within at least 10 days before the start of the fiscal year. So in our case, we have to pass a balanced budget by June 20th.
Okay.
Or we have
And that's
violated
back to
state law.
that zero balance, positive balance
In
that we were
each fund,
talking about.
yes.
Got it. Okay. if council passes that budget and then through review or something comes up throughout the year, what does the process for changing that look like? Is that their only chance to change the budget?
No, throughout the year, the council has the ability to appropriate funds out of fund balance to do things that were not anticipated in the budget, or if expenses are for this thing that they anticipated to be done are costing more, they can appropriate money for that. Mid-year appropriations are an ongoing process. The budget preparation process is an ongoing process. We started preparing this budget back in September, and there have been meetings going on with the council's finance committee and in study sessions and meetings throughout the year. We actually started the hardcore processes of preparing this budget in January. And we have had several public meetings and public hearings in April and May and June, where the public throughout the year can give input to their council members or to our office about what they would like to see in the budget or would not like to see in the budget. And those things are taken into account. What is going to be emphasized in the current budget year is always a process that's going on throughout the year. Some years we've had input from council that they wanted to emphasize sidewalks, for example. One year we had a big emphasis on animal welfare. Just, it's an ongoing process about what will be emphasized or de-emphasized throughout the year.
Because we only have a limited amount of funding to do what we want, right?
Yes, that's right.
So you talked about appropriating new funds if something costs more during the year, but can you reduce funds during the
Yes.
year, or? Okay, so throughout the year,
Just
if you
as the
decide.
council can
Okay.
appropriate funds out of the savings account or fund balance, council can de-appropriate funds and put money back into the savings
Okay.
account and reduce the checking account, the expenditure lines.
Got it. Okay, it looks like maybe we have another public question here. Bryce, will you read that?
Yeah, another question from Norman Citizens for Racial Justice. Does the general fund have less rules, like ordinances, limiting what can be done with those funds? Or are they just different than the rules that govern funds like the public safety sales tax fund?
Another great question.
Very good question. Yeah, generally speaking, the general fund is the most flexible fund as far as what funds can be used for or not. The reason that you set up special revenue funds is for the reason that there is some string attached to what these revenues can be used for. But in the general fund, no, it's general. It's the taxes of the city can be used more flexibly than the parkland development money that can only be used for parkland development. And that's why you put those more restrictive things in a separate fund.
And again, that's because it comes just from the general sales tax and not from a specific sales tax.
That's correct.
Okay, or bond or other
Yeah,
revenue
franchise
source.
fees or,
Got it, okay. So what would that look like, what would the process look like for a citizen to get involved with, say they have a project that they're passionate about, or want to examine funding for a certain department or program? What would the process look like for them bringing that through from showing up at City Hall and saying, hey, this is something we're passionate about, we'd like to maybe see a change on this? How would they get involved? What would that look like?
Yeah, things take time,
Yeah.
but what we would encourage citizens to do is first contact their council member or the mayor, contact the city manager and say, this is what I'm passionate about, this is what I'd like to see done. I'll give you an example. If you can picture the Sam Noble Museum of Natural History, that was a citizen-led initiative, both at the city level and the state level. There was all these massive collections of archaeological artifacts that they wanted to be preserved and displayed in a museum. And it took 2 or 3 years, but 2 or 3 citizens moved that forward to ultimately become a general obligation bond issue for the city and the state to pay for that museum to house those artifacts. So that's kind of how it works. Smaller things, if there's a pothole outside of my house, call the Public Works Department, say I want this pothole fixed. The Public Works Department has a budget for patching potholes. They'll come out, they have to come out within 24 hours and at least barricade the pothole, and usually they'll have it fixed within 24 hours. So again, it varies based on kind of how big the desire is. but the process is pretty much the same.
And you brought up an interesting point there with the Sam Noble Museum and the interaction between the state and city. What does that look like? I mean, I know that we get some funds from the state, and those must be used for certain things. Add to some of the funds, transit fund, that kind of thing. What does a relationship look like between city government and county or state government? I know we have some agreements with the county. You know, we're within the county,
Right.
and they pay for some things that we don't. So what does that look like budgetarily?
Budgetarily, the different levels of government have different responsibilities. A lot of times, we will get questions about the schools, where folks want the city to do something about the schools, where the schools are not the city's jurisdiction. The schools have a separate district that is funded by a school district property tax for their operations. But we have a lot of questions about the school resource officer program, where within the public safety sales tax, the citizens of Norman said that they wanted to partner with the school district to put City of Norman police officers into the schools. So part of that sales tax was used to pay these officers. Half of their cost basically comes from the school district, half of their cost comes from the city's sales tax to provide that service within the schools. So there's different relationships. You talked about the county. We have relationships with the county to maintain the rural arterial roads out in East Norman, where the city buys the materials and the county crews actually do the work of chip sealing and paving those rural roads. So there's different answers to each of those questions for various jurisdictions that overlap within the city.
One topically that I think might be of interest to some of the people watching today is investment in mental health. Is that something the city does, and where would that fall? I know that county does that, but what would that look like if city wanted to invest in that more, or how would we go about that?
Again, the major jurisdiction for mental health is within the State Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. But the city has great partnerships with the Department of Mental Health for things such as our provision of mental health services provided from general fund payments to nonprofit organizations like Thunderbird House and those sorts of things that provide mental health services. The Mary Abbott Children's House, for example, gets money from the general fund. So all of those things working together to provide those services that we know that we need. It so happens that Norman, being historically the state mental hospital, Griffin Hospital, happens to be in Norman. So we have a greater diversity of those sorts of mental health services than any other city in the state. And that's a good thing. And yes, the city does partner to provide those services, even though the major responsibility lies with the state.
And it's not like this, or, I mean, you can answer this for me better, but if council decided we wanted 5 new mental health officers, or, how would we go about that? That wouldn't be, we wouldn't pay the county for that, right? Or what would the
It would depend. I
relationship
mean,
with that
we
look
would
like?
have to explore how that partnership would work. But obviously, if the city were funding those additional positions, they would probably be state employees, but there would be some strings attached to the money that the city is paying to the
Yeah.
state to pay for those employees. We would obviously require that the services be in Norman, those sorts of things. We might say we want to emphasize child protective services as opposed to alcohol abuse and however it might be written up. But again, the important thing from the budgetary standpoint is the city is partnering, providing services and providing money for this area that we want to emphasize, even though another jurisdiction has a major responsibility for it. It can be done.
Okay, interesting. Are we getting any more public comments?
Not seeing any at the moment.
Okay, great. So, summarize, it's a big budget book, lots of things here, and people that want to get involved can come and call you.
Absolutely.
And it's a good thing, I think, that we have all of this information available, while it might seem daunting, because it's available. If you have a question about anything, we can see exactly where it's spent, right?
Yes, ma'am. My number's 405-366-5413. Call me at any time. We will get your questions answered. I'm the only Francisco that works for the city. My email is anthony.francis.
Yeah, another one just appeared. Norman Citizens for Racial Justice asks, what about something like affordable housing? How does that show up in the budget?
That's
Again,
great, we
a very
actually
good
have that,
question.
right?
Yeah. The city of Norman has historically provided housing services and homeless services through our community development department, mostly through funding from the federal community development block grant. Norman is what's called an entitlement city, which means basically because of our population of 125,000, we get X number of dollars, okay, just because of our population. And as an aside, I know you're the census person. Just understand how important it is to fill out the census because we get money based on our population, okay? So that's how we're providing
Great plug,
this.
fill out the census if you haven't, you still can. So, we get
so
money
yeah.
based on our population, right?
Yes, and out of those CDBG funds, we provide homeless services and affordable housing services. I won't give you the areas or the addresses, but the city has actually built out of those CDBG funds several affordable housing units that are scattered throughout the town and that are available at reduced rents.
So, again, another example of where we have funding that's coming from a different source and is dedicated just to being spent on this
Absolutely.
area of interest.
Yes.
And I
The
guess that's.
CDBG funds, if you have that affordable housing interest, there's a process by which the CDBG funds are used each year. Public hearing processes, there's a CDBG committee. So if a person has that interest, you might want to follow those processes and get involved with the CDBG committee.
Absolutely, great plug. And that's an example of why it is important that why it's beneficial to have these different funds for different things, because that money can't be used
Can't be used for anything else.
It's dedicated just to that.
Right.
Great plug. Any other questions?
Not seeing any new ones at the moment.
All right, well, I think with that, Anthony, thank you so much for your time today and for taking the time to
Absolutely.
explain this to us. This will not be our last conversation on this topic. We'll continue, if you have questions, continue to contact us. You can contact Anthony. We'll be dropping that information in the description of this video. And you can always reach out and get your questions answered after the fact. So thank you for joining us for this first video in our City Government 101. We look forward to discussing more important topics with you to help you get involved with your local government. Thank you.
Thank you.